Welcome to the first Global Forum on Climate Change Law and Institutions 2022. I am the moderator and MC, Kim Seo-eun of the Graduate School of the Kerr University. As hosted by the KLRI and CSDLAP and the KSCCR and the Center for Climate and Marine Governments. And we are also going to have the discussions and presentations on the title of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and NDC implementations by Republic of Korea. And welcome the President of Korea Legislation Research Institute, Kye-Hong, for opening remarks. Good afternoon, everyone. For all the distinguished guests, thank you very much and nice to see you. And I am the president of the Korea Legislation Research Institute, Kye-Hong. And for online and offline participants, I sincerely welcome everyone for your participation. And my also special thanks also go to the representatives and the participants from the foreign countries as well. And our team, the Law and Institutions team, has conducted the forums on the climate change law and institutions throughout last year. And as of now, the just transition was the first theme of the forum, as well as the CBAM and the climate adaptation, the policies and the measures by the Biden government, as well as the challenges and the solutions. We have also talked about the priorities and the key issues throughout the last year's forum. And taking this opportunity, we are also joined by the Jong-Soo, the director of the CSDLAP, for such very good dedications and commitments. And today, we are scheduled to have the first Global Forum on Climate Change Law and Institutions with the hot topics and priorities in terms of the climate change today. So I'm also looking forward to having a lot of the fruitful outcomes. For the first theme of today's forum, as discussed by the Glasgow, the conference, probably this is one of the way that we can also talk about more in-depth discussions on the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which has been fulfilled and the NDC implementation has been adopted. In terms of these NDC implementations and long-term, the carbon mitigation targets and the measures are very critical of the time. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement as well as the ITMO are also reflecting a lot of the international norms and regulations in order to fulfill the NDC implementations. In this regard, we also need to focus on the measures, how to really implement the NDC. As the Carbon Neutrality, the Basic Act, along with the project, we also have the regulations within Korea. Considering the domestic as well as international circumstances in reducing the carbon emissions, and it's very urgent need that we have to specify our measures and the efforts to implement the NDC. And throughout today's forum, we are also looking forward to taking and discussing a lot of the good fruitful outcomes and solutions in order to implement the NDC as well as the ITMO. And taking this opportunity, I'd like to also especially thank the founder and executive director of ERCST, Andrei Marcu, as well as the chief economist of the EDF, Suzi Kerr, and senior advisor of the CSDLAP, and Sang-Hyup, the director of the Jeju Research Institute, and the chairman of the Korean Society of the Climate Change Research, Dong-woon. Thank you very much for your participation and efforts. And today we are also joined by the working level, the representatives and experts, so that we can really share the knowledge and experience throughout the roundtable discussion later as well. And in the future, in mitigating the climate change, the law and institutions will be the further facilitate as we hope so. I really hope that we can really have very fruitful outcomes and solutions throughout our discussion and presentations. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. And Jong-Soo, the professor and his team. Thank you very much for your commitments and dedication. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, President Kim, for your opening remarks. We are going to invite Senior Advisor of CSDLAP, Yoon Jong-Soo, for welcoming remarks. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Yoon Jong-Soo, Senior Advisor of CSDLAP. For the forum, as co-host, by putting a lot of the efforts and support, I'd like to especially thank the president of the KLRI, Kye-Hong, and one of the very pioneers in the green economy, Sang-Hyup, the president of Jeju Research Institute, and Dong-woon, president of Korean Society of Climate Change Research, and the keynote presenters and the panelists. Thank you very much for your participation. On behalf of CSDLAP, the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and the implementation of the Korean NDC will be the key topic, so I'm very delighted to discuss these very good, important issues. CSDLAP, after the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, has been leading our proactive efforts and discussions on the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, domestically as well as internationally. That's why we are also invited very excellent experts and the representatives today. As you're well aware, the greenhouse gas emission targets was one of the very ambitious targets from the previous administration. The 40% the reduction against for the 2030. The Paris Agreement, the Article 6, will be also more utilized upon the international cooperation, and this must be fulfilled. And as for me, along with the ITMO, I have a lot of the questions. In order to implement NDC, the ITMO is one of the issues that we can really maximize or have some limited amount of the ITMO for the benefits of the stakeholders and the countries. And for NDC, we also need to consider whether the structures or mechanism will be very fulfilling. As well as for INDC and NDC, we still need to also consider the interconnecting factors altogether. So in this regard, our seminar and forum is very meaningful and significant. As the UNFCCC was also joined by the founder and executive director of ERCST, the Andrei Marcu, and the chief economist of the EDF, Suzi Kerr, with the expertise of the market mechanism, will be the keynote speaker for today's forum. They are very excellent and experts in the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as well as the roles of the forest, probably throughout their presentations. In terms of the ITMO, the ITMO policies, and it's definitely we need to have the collaborations, all the related authorities as well. So in this regard, we are also looking forward to taking a lot of the fruitful discussions, which will be joined by all the representatives from the institutions and the authorities as well. And taking this opportunity, I'd like to also go to the president of the KLRI for your dedication. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your welcoming remarks.
말씀이 있겠습니다.
I'd like to invite the President Kim Sang-Hyup of the Jeju Research Institute, and he will provide first welcoming remarks.
Pleasure to share my thoughts with you in this important seminar today. I really want to join the seminar in person, but I'm sorry I could not do so due to another commitment I made beforehand. Well, now the new administration led by President Yoon has just started. I myself, together with my team members, including Professor Suh-Yong, worked to help the Yoon administration set up the policies of climate change and energy through the Presidential Transition Committee. During our team's work, we came to learn that the previous government's carbon neutrality policy did not lead to reducing greenhouse gas emissions as planned. Rather, during the first year of the implementation of the carbon neutrality policy, which is 2021, the actual emission had increased by more than 4%. While the previous Lee Myung-bak administration, for which I served as the senior secretary to the president for green roads, for example, raised the price of electricity 7 times as part of the low carbon green roads policy. But the Moon administration did not raise the electricity price at all, thereby leaving huge burden to the new administration. But that should not be an excuse for non-action. We don't want to play blame game at all. We need to do our best with the spirit of responsible action. For that, my team, during our work in the Presidential Transition Committee, suggested the following policies the upcoming administration. First, restructuring energy mix with an adequate balance between the renewables and nuclear energies. We also need power sector reform. More than anything else, we need to make electricity price setting mechanism independent from political pressure or populism. This reform would lead meaningful consequences to our energy market and consumer behavior. Second, R&D reform to make Korea indispensable when it comes to green and climate core technology. Third, strengthening climate finance in line with ESG activities of the private sector and reform tax policy. Finally, developing a climate energy alliance with major international partner countries such as the US, Germany, etc., and strengthening global cooperation. Today's seminar is particularly important in the context of global cooperation. During the course of implementation of Korea's NDC, we will strengthen our international cooperation with both developed and developing countries by using the policy measures under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. According to the Korean NDC target, Korea needs to reduce greenhouse gases by using Article 6 measures to a large extent. This will be a process of creating jobs and other business opportunities for the Korean people and businesses, I believe. In other words, we think it is important to integrate public climate finance and private sector investment into the activities under the Article 6. We also consider that it is very important for Korea to develop its own creative and innovative policies that can be a global model for other countries and international organizations, I hope. This means we will not simply copy the Article 6. We want to be a creator for the world as an indispensable country. In this context, I look forward to seeing successful outcomes from today's seminar. Thank you.
네, 다음 쭉.
Next, I'd like to invite the President No Dong-woon of the Korean Society of Climate Change Research. Nice to meet you. President Kye-Hong of the Korea Legislation Research Institute, Senior Advisor to CSDLAP, and President Sang-Hyup of Jeju Research Institute, Director, Founder and Executive Director of ERCST, Chief Economist at EDF, and other discussants and panelists. I'd like to welcome you all to the first Global Forum on Climate Change Law and Institutions. As you know, the Korean government is making an effort to meet the target by using the ITMO. And the private sector companies need to use the 5% of the ITMO. It means that more than 20 million tons will be used to meet the NDC target. And the Korean government can need to use the ITMO by the amount of 50 million tons a year. And corresponding adjustment is also important in terms of the ITMO. And the host country need to compare the cost of ITMO and other projects under other mechanisms. In the perspective of investing country like Korea, we need to consider the situation that the host country provides the high-cost project. There is a high-hanging fruit instead of low-hanging fruit. In this context, we need to have a clear and smart strategy to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions at lower cost. Dr. Andrei and Suzi were the negotiator and the experts who participated in the COP agreement. And all the participants who are participating here as a discussant are a working level personnel who are involved in the climate change policies in Korea. I'd like to also thank Mr. Professor Jong-Soo for all the preparation of this meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your congratulatory remarks. This is all prepared for the opening ceremony. We will take a photo together and then continue our seminar.
Thank you. My name is Suh-Yong Chung, professor here at Korea University. Also, I'm the director of the CSDLAP, which is another hosting organization for today's seminar. Because many of the participants are here are Koreans, so now I would like to use the Korean language. I hope that that is okay with everybody. So, 고려대학교의 정소영입니다.
I am Professor Jong-Soo of Korea University. For seminars, we have some orders, and for very specific the outlines and the programs, probably I'll be spending the 15 minutes for introducing the objectives and the issues and the expected outcome throughout today's seminar. So not only just to the online and offline participants, so that we can really share the real and the feasible the effects after today's forum. So that's a very special the session for the seminar introduction. As you're well aware, and as also discussed and participated by the experts, and today's seminar will be talking on the very important issue of the climate change. As also President Sang-Hyup mentioned earlier, as of the May, with the new administration of the Yoon, the new president, and as we also participate in the transition, the committee for the new president, and with the directors, the committee, we are also joined as a member for the transition committee. And the climate change as a part of the global leadership was one of the issues that we focused on. From the previous targets, from the previous administration, the 40%, the NDC targets will be also estimated as lower from the previous target, along with some of the concerns on the nuclear energy as well. But we cannot really guarantee that our policies and plan are fulfilling by 100%. But as also touched and mentioned by the Kim Sang-Hyup, the president of the Jeju Research Institute earlier, as we will be having new ministers and the vice ministers of the new administration, and considering those new transitions, such a recommended the ideas will be also effective for the new administration. So our recommendations are actually have the very basic conclusion that we'll be also working on the better outcomes. Of course, the 40% will be the fluctuating, but for the research conducted by the Transition Committee, as of the 2020, and the 40% by 2030, the reduction on that every year, we have to also reduce the 4% every year. But as of the last year, we already reduced the more than 4% throughout the last year. So with the new administration by Mr. Yoon Suk-yeol, the president, based on the science, such a reasonable, the NDC targets, creating the more jobs, as well as the leadership of the global climate will be also the taking as well. This, of course, requires a lot of the good experts, knowledge, and the ideas. So throughout the forum, we are also looking forward to taking the more fruitful outcomes as well. So in this perspective, I also hope that we have requested a lot of the experts to participate on the venue, not only just taking the online participation. So taking this opportunity, I'd like to also express my gratitude to your participation for the offline participants as well by taking your time as well. So first of all, let me give the objectives of today's seminar. As you're well aware, still the Carbon Neutrality Act are the ones that we are also targeting at the same time. But we also need to think of the ways how to utilize and how to apply the Carbon Neutrality Act of Korea. There are some of the groups domestically as well as internationally, but still there are some the same directions or maybe some differences. In this regard, the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement ought to be more specified in detail. Of course, as one of the representatives of the meeting and the team, we still think of how much we can understand the Article 6. In particular, as you're well aware, the Article 6 probably is one of the very familiar terms, but the CDM would be one of the projects that you are think of for the first time on the Article 6. But the new mechanism from not only just from the UN, but our own tailored, the article, the 6.1 should be also tailored in terms of our domestic circumstances in Korea. In this regard, we have to focus on the current status of how much we can complement or improve the attitudes and actions for implementation. And probably the two experts will be also joined later as the presenters later, who are very excellent and outstanding experts in the related field. So taking the presentations later, and we can also check and review and share a lot of the directions and the measures for Korea so that we can really have very better ideas and solutions leading to the win-win partnership for Korea as well as international cooperation as well. So once again, let me also highlight that as we highlighted many times ago, so 40% reduction target by 2030 as of the 2018, as mentioned before by the Mr. Yoon already, the senior advisor, whether we can reduce or increase the NDC target for Korea will be also one of the concerns that we can also still keep discussing in the future. But as of Korea, for the climate, the response and the new measures and solutions definitely require the other countries' cooperation together. So that can also bringing more the positive outcomes effects, so that if we have some the more rooms for further reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, then we can also have to have the more better ideas. But as also mentioned here, the CCUS, as you can highlight it here, as the Moon Jae-in, the previous administration, as a very big portion of the government agendas. And if you look at the CCS, could be also one of the concerns that we can only fulfill within Korea, or this may require international cooperation. And these are the key priorities that we can discuss today. we also need to think of how much we can really fulfill the NDC or revise the NDC targets by considering the domestic as well as international circumstances. And we also need to set or think of the starting point. This requires very in-depth understanding of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. In this regard, and for the ITMO reduction, we also need to consider whether we can really include or make some revise on the ITMO, but still, we also need to think of the ways and how the ITMO is very meaningful. So I really hope that we can more have times to discuss these key issues, of course. So I'm not really here to present all the ideas here, but as you are aware, the Article 6 is the mechanisms that can also apply all the key issues, as I mentioned before. And for the 6.3 will be also the leading the part that we are focusing for Korea. But Article 6.2 and 6.3, as we have the Glasgow, the rules, and from the 6.2 and 6.3, but probably as of the 2015, the Article 6.2 was one of the key topic because the Article 6.3 mechanisms along with the CDM in reducing reducing the greenhouse gas emission targets, and by 2030, so ITMO, it's not only just limited to the domestic NDC target, but we also need to think of the ways how we can really improve the CDM and the mechanisms. As I also heard from the CDM, the experts, in 20 or 30%, the target, it's only the feasible as of the current status of the review and investigation. So if we only take the project still that the revised the NDC target will be very challenging to meet together. So that we can also think of the solutions, how to really have the better ways for the revised the NDC targets. As you can see here, the chart as I made up by myself, and it would be also appreciated if you understand this chart for the mechanisms under Article 6, 6.2 and 6.3 are the major parts that we are focusing. But the 6.3, on the perspectives of the host country, how much the mitigation outcomes can be credits or other types of the tools. But in that regard, if you call the ITMO, the ITMO, be not really exact terms, but still the mitigation, the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, or as a part of the credits under this Article 6.4, within the borders of the countries, we also need to how those countries can really fulfill their NDC targets, but that cannot really fulfill completely only taking the Article 6.4. But if you look at the blue parts here, if we talk about the ITMO here and the mitigation outcomes beyond the borders of the host countries, the transfer is also being available. International transfer, the mitigation outcomes, the ITMO could be also credits or other types of the tools. Considering these circumstances, under the Article 6.2, on the perspective of host country, for example, into Korea, this is only the main pathway from the host country into Korea. But not only that, especially for Korea, as we are also joined by the governments and authorities here, beyond the capacities, you can also think of the ways that we can further improve. But that does not really stipulated by under all the Article 6.3, and probably the cooperative mechanism will be also understandable. But the JCM could be one of the examples of the Article 6.2. But mitigation outcomes and the transfers and for the host countries and all the related activities are under the mechanism, the JCM. That's the definition of the JCM under the Kyoto Protocol. So if we utilize the JCM effectively, then probably we can lead to a lot of the better outcomes along with the implementations of the Paris Agreement. So while we are also focusing on the ways to make the fulfilling the requirements under the related articles, but when it comes to the international community, as we are also joined by the Professor Andrei, Marcu, and Suzi Kerr as the two presenters later. And the most parts are the purchase agreements, So credits by the host countries, all the pathways from the host countries will be also dealing with the issues. So there are a lot of the issues of the pathways from the host countries. In that regard, for example, like for the Korean government in implementing NDC targets, then the greenhouse gas, the credits could be also the purchase from other countries. But there are a lot of the inquiries and requests from the National Assembly if we do that, because they think that we may spend a lot of the money on the taxpayers' money. So under the Article 6.4, and probably a lot of the mechanisms will be the applications for the businesses and the bringing the credits from the other countries, for especially the big companies within the Korean market. But beyond the borders, national borders of Korea, we also need to think of the ways how we can utilize some of the more potential mechanisms under the article, the 6.5, as we're also joined by the representatives of the Korea Forest Service. But the RED Plus, the project, is available from the host country as a part of the way for the deforestation. By utilizing the ITMO, the Article 6.2 should be also combined for Korea in the perspective. Article 6.2 mechanism, including the ITMO, for example, the Article 6.4 could be also included as a subpart, as well as the RED plus the project as the combined factors. Now, this is not only limited to the developing countries, but also to developed countries. For example, if we export oil to Saudi Arabia, then the greenhouse gas emissions reduction will be also significant in the future if we pull our capabilities in a manner. There are a lot of the ways that we can also consider a lot of the different countries' capabilities. In this regard, this Article 6.2 and the transfers, all the mechanisms are to be also considered in the future. In that regard, we need to have such a comprehensive the mechanisms and the management for the effective manner. But as I also mentioned, by the carbon neutrality commission, and still we also need to seize more opportunities in the future for the full implementation by taking awareness on such challenges for your reference. For my last part, for the private sector, let me also share the more overviews, because I'm not only a presenter today, but let me give the very brief overview, not raising some of the issues here, as we are also joined by all the ministries and the related government authorities. But private sector investment is very critical so that we can also utilize those private sector's investment. But this cannot be fulfilled by the intentions or the policies for the government perspectives, because the NDC target is one of the key priority. But the Glasgow, as adopted and discussed as of the last year, and the perspectives of the businesses, the credit, the transfers, and corresponding adjustment for the private sectors, the stakeholders, and the relationships are to be also considered. And for Korea, we also need to consider the combinations by utilizing the private sector's investment as well. As also mentioned by the President, Mr. No, earlier, and still the ITMO would be the one that I mentioned earlier. But the ETS and the inventory are the two factors that we also need to consider under the Article 13, as we have to submit the reports for the inventories for the Korean government. But this is not only simple, the procedures. In this regard, all the related areas of the private sectors and the involvement is also very important. As I requested to give the lectures on the ESG, and a lot of the attendees and participants are also talking about corresponding adjustment, but they are not really fully aware of the spectrum or definition of all the corresponding adjustment. Of course, the ETS is one of the key themes that we can think of for the first time. But for the inventory market, so a lot of the countries are not really fully aware of using their inventory and NDC targets. But for Korea, the complex market is only available within the Korean market. Still, we may be also wondering if we have to make the voluntary markets or not. And for the private sector, in accordance with the Carbon Neutrality Act, as we also done the corresponding adjustment for the registration, still, we also need to think of the ways and the measures how to really make some interactions as well. And as was adopted and discussed by the Glasgow, and still for the greenhouse gas emissions and reduction targets are to be also more fully discussed, whether we can really set the targets for the NDC targets as well. And within the Korean market, the policies within the Korean market and the NDC or the MDC, the targets or other the ETS mechanisms are to be more specified and chosen. Still, we also need to check the review on the proportions that how much the Korean government is making the ways and proportions, so that we can also have the more implications from these key priorities. And in this regard, we absolutely have to develop the Korean tailored mechanisms for the implementation. And for private sector, still, there may be some interest of the stakeholders in the private sector. So this can require the national circumstances under the Article 6.2 mechanism. And this can also be more tailored to the Korean market along with international cooperation as well. We also need to think and review how we can make some consensus with other countries as well. And you can also refer to the contents and information throughout my presentation slides. So in fact, especially considering the localized conditions in Korea as part of the MDC target, we can have the more presentations from the two experts later, and the roundtable discussion will be also conducted later as well as the last part of today's program, so that we can really have the more ideas and the fruitful discussions today. So that will be the end of the seminar introduction. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just introduce the purposes and objectives of this seminar with some the little backgrounds in order to raise some of the interesting questions, I hope, that for everybody during the seminar discussions. And then as the first step, then I'd like to introduce the two speakers from the overseas. So first speaker is Mr. Andrei Marcu. He is the founder and executive director of ERCST. Andrei has been one of the leading Article 6 negotiators in the world, and then I myself have known him for several years already. And then he kindly agreed to join our seminar today so that he can update us about some of the cutting-edge issues regarding the Article 6. And then followed Andrei, then we will have a second speaker, Dr. Suzi Kerr from the Environment Defense Fund. So as the first step, Andrei, how are you? Thank you for joining us.
Very good. I'm fine, except that I'm hearing you very broken up. I'm not sure the sound was very, very good until after the break. Now I can hardly hear you. I don't know how well you hear me.
Okay, I hear you very well, by the way. So I think you can now start. Andrei, do you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Right. We hear you clearly.
Good, good. Well, look, following your presentation, that was a pretty complete presentation. So that is going to make a difficult follow-up to that presentation, Suh-Yong, that you made. First of all, my regrets that I cannot be in Seoul. I was planning to be in Seoul, but in the end, the current travel situation is still not totally conducive to international travel outside Europe for us. I will make some remarks, but again, it is challenging because your presentation was very complete and very all-encompassing. Now, what we do know is that this time, I mean, there's a lot of, there's a few known and a lot of unknowns. One of them is we know the ambition of the Korean MDC and the fact that 11% of it is going to come from external sources. Now that's about 33 million tons. It is tons. It is not enormous, but it is significant amount of tons, no doubt about it, and will require an important effort, a combined effort from the. Are you hearing an echo? Because I'm hearing an echo now. Let me get off my, because I think that it is probably easier without a headphone. Can you hear me? Can you still hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well.
All right, sorry about it. There are a number of, as Professor Suh-Yong mentioned, is the fact that there are many ways to go about sourcing and thinking about participating in Article 6 and sourcing things to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. You know, there are, as he mentioned before, there are 3 pieces or 4 pieces of Article 6. The 2 that really deal with market are 6.2 and 6.4. They're different in the sense, I mean, they have the same purpose. The purpose is to provide a framework for transferring ITMOs or emission reduction from one jurisdiction to the other. They're produced somewhere and need to be the Republic of Korea toward its own NDC. The difference is in the governance. And the difference in the governance is that we need to deal in Article 6.4 with very centralized governance, a very UN governance with all the pluses and minuses that we've had and we've seen in the CDM and the joint implementation, while the other one, 6.2, is something that is largely unknown, still a lot of discovery to be made. So if you are looking at, you know, kind of start thinking as Republic of Korea, what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this? I would start by saying that Article 6.4 is going to be a complex one, and it's going to take, I suspect, a while to get going. At least that is my opinion. The last time we met in Montreux, we are holding an informal dialogue of Article 6 negotiated, and there were about 45 of them in Cohen in Montreux, in Switzerland, about 3 weeks ago. Last time we met there, the report was about 50% of the seats on the supervisory board of the Article 6.4 have been filled. So there are a lot of constituencies that have not filled that. That will make it probably by substa. I think the constituency will get their effort together and will have the whole full nomination, or so we hope. But nevertheless, it will still be a complex thing. It is not what we did with the CDM when we started from zero, but it will be complex because people simply don't want to have a new CDM. Frankly, there was nothing much in the CDM that you're going to do a hell of a lot better in the Article 6.4. You can do something better at the edges. You can make changes at the edges. Hardly you're not going to be able to drastically change the Article 6.4 to make it better. Now, when I say better, you have to think as to what you do with it. And we have always been of the opinion that, you know, this is the Climate Change Convention, and Article 6.4 is to create a protocol for emission reductions to be created under the UN protocol and transferred from country A to Republic of Korea to be used. If you start to introduce a lot of conditionalities, then the whole thing gets very complicated. Markets are simple. If you give them a clear objective, they will work well in an efficient way. If you start confusing them, this is going to be very, very complicated. My hunch is that, and looking at the cast of character that are getting on the supervisory board, this is very much a lot of people that have a lot of people to regard this as a sustainable development mechanism. So this is not going to be a simple mechanism that is going to have at its core functions, but it's going to have so many bells and whistles that my view is this is going to take a while to become operational in a real efficient way. And the reason why I use markets is because of efficiency. If you're interested in not efficiency, then you can use some other mechanism. Now, So that brings you to Article 6.2. Now, Article 6.2 is not an article that we have dealt with before. It's an article that is new. I think the closest it will come to is probably joint implementation, but we're far away from joint implementation. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Now, if Korea has a choice to make between, put a lot of my eggs in the 6.4 or 6.2 basket, my advice would be to look very clearly at 6.2. It's quite clear there will be people, in Korea that will be wanting to use for a variety of reasons Article 6.4, and there will be some that will, but I suspect the majority will try, to the extent that the Korean government is helpful, use Article 6.2. But how would you go about doing this? And you need to think a little bit as to what are the options. In the end, the Paris Agreement is a party agreement, so it is the NDC needs to be fulfilled by the government, doesn't need to be fulfilled by private sector. So the first option of the day you have to think about is, purchasing for sovereign compliance. So is the Republic of Korea going to go and purchase for sovereign compliance? The second one is to continue to allow the use of international credits for Korean ETS compliance. That is another option. And finally is potentially encouraging the private sector to take on targets and meet them through IDMOs. That is a little bit counterintuitive. It goes at least my instinct of a person, but it is quite clear that you have Korean large industry taking on voluntary targets and having those in the state in order to help the NDC. So this is where probably the voluntary markets come in. But as has been mentioned before, there's a special voluntary market. This voluntary market to authorize it, not authorize it, and its corresponding adjustments. The other thing Republic of Korea is going to do, like all the other parties, there's a provision to say that parties will have a. Now that is turning to be a very personal statement, because if you listen to the conversation that has been taken, the conversation that been taken prior, there's been a number of informal panels, including ours. There's going to be the technical dialogue that is put on by the chair of SABSTA, what the registry means and what the whole infrastructure looks like. It's by no means a done deal. We thought we understood what it was, but the reality is we don't. If you'll allow me for 1 second, somebody has left I need to close the window because it's getting very nervous. I apologize for this. Sorry about this. It's unexpected. People have left the window overnight and nothing outside, so I have to 1 second. Now, I would say, there's a that have to have a national registry. The national assets of IDMO, a variety of registries. Was there our VCS or some in the ownership of the NDC at the end of the DC? It shows that holding your assets in sometimes a risky business. I would, and you don't know what the policy and the political will happen. So I would encourage very much the Republic of Korea to national registry in the national territory. Now, the other thing that make a decision as a Korea, because these are decisions a number of to make, is what is going to be the ESOP participation of Republic of Korea in Article 6. Do you see yourself, as purchasers? So somebody, whether it is private sector, government, or will purchase that somehow are going to be used by the Korean state towards the NDC, or do you see Korea as a trade partner? which case, and that will color the kind of assets that you are allowed to keep in your registry, and the kind of organizations that will be allowed to keep have accounts in the national registry, and the kind and by the Republic of in Article 6. So we will have to make that authorization allow parties to a buyer or a seller, but it's either in Korea. Now, if in case you agree, you accept the fact that in order to have a market and market participation, you're going to have a trading hub, which implies buyers and sellers. Then, if you start allowing export in some way of ITMOs, then a mechanism is going to have to put in place to ensure that the private sector does not get the benefits of that, the compensation, financial compensation, and the government gets caught with the corresponding adjustment and needs to make it up and has to buy additional credits on time. So a mechanism such a in a fund will have to something that you have to think about it. Now, the other thing that you need to think, what kind of ITMO? So this is another type of decision that it's something that probably and some countries have made complicated decision on this topic. So there may be sectoral choices, geographical choices, technology choices, vintage choices. So these are kind of decisions that you need to take. And you have to remember that these are all going in the report that you have to make on Article 6. So there's going to be a lot of transparency. Now, I would argue that the more conditionality, the bill for the private sector and where the Republic of Korea is going to be. In the end, whether we like it or not, and I see people in the room and some people in the national audience, the purpose of using it credits, to my mind, the way it's been done is because its efficiency and lowering the cost of compliance. That, there is always the argument that you don't use it, you want to do it all at home, but you don't want to. But that implies that you try within the limits of what's acceptable and what's ethical, that you will use as fewer restrictions as possible, or you can use more, but the price that comes associated with that. The other thing that I see, that is that there is the ETS in Korea, and that is another way to use, and that you can link with other emission trading systems around the world in order to, first of all, for issue of competitiveness, but also for being able to have access to allowances from other systems. And that is a complex system. This is a complex decision. We looked at the EU, and the Swiss system is taking a long time. Now, there will be a special for that. But nevertheless, it will not be an easy thing. Interesting and something to be followed, but something that we want to bring you in the very short-term relief and the certainty what's being available. Now, if you want to go about to think about the instruments that you use in order to, and I think this has been mentioned, is a bit repetitive here, and I apologize, but this is what my notes say, so we are in. How do you do this? Remember, in the old days, in the technical days, most countries had a national fund. The Spanish fund, there was the Italian fund, funds where countries money, they pooled money through private sector money in many cases in order to go purchase from abroad. The efficiency and also the fact that in many cases, many companies may not wish to do so because it's a complicated business. This is not their main business. That means that to make cameras or TVs or cars or steel, their main business is not trading of IDMOS and the arcane use of our assets. So it's possible that it's something that you want to do. The other thing that you want to see very well about this one is the fact that you have your Japanese colleagues that have set up the joint crediting mechanism. And that is provided them an access, an outlet for Japanese technology, and in this case, Korea, of a lot of is a trading nation. So there is a lot of technology that you could be using in this context, and have access to a network of countries in which you do business. The only thing that I would argue is that you are in 2022, 2023 right now. The Japanese have started this 2016, 15, 16, I don't remember when. So it's taking them about 6-7 years to pull network together. The question is it worth it to do this in terms of starting like a totally unique mechanism? Is it better to try imagine use international institutions such as GGGI, which actually is located in Seoul and has a very good team that is doing a lot of good work on that, the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, rather than creating something? It is an important effort that goes into creating such a network, a national standard, and a network. It has a lot of benefits because Korea, it's a reputational matter. It's also privileged access to things, but the effort is not negligible and it's not something that should be taken lightly. So something that is going to have to be analyzed and in the end a political decision. One important element is that in the article in the CDM we use POAs and projects, simple projects in dealing in creating emission reduction. But we are seeing now work, including through type approaches in order to create interest. This is something that I think that Korea should be looking at, because kind of having a very broad and deep intervention that has a, if you want, a significant change factor in the power sector, another sector, and maybe something that is not competitive in your industry, should be looking at. One other issue that has been under discussion lately is that, and it is related to mistakes, there's no doubt about it, the creating of these international clubs. International clubs are going to be, if you want, in my opinion, they're going to be controversial. It's not going to be easy to set up, but it's something that may start to emerge. After the discussion started from the European CBAM, there's going to be a carbon pricing element to it. And that carbon pricing element to it, I think it's important because the one risk that you have, a race to the bottom. In the case of the EU so far has expressed no intention using IDMOS for their domestic, for their NDC compliance, but they've been very insistent in ensuring that in a super high environmental component to the decision in the Article 6. And to me, that's what it is the environmental concern that obviously permeates a lot of the decision in this commission of the European Union. But whether it's intentional or not, but the result will also be that you ensure that if, of course, for your own entity, you want to make sure that IDMO is going to be the highest standard. The highest standard also makes it expensive. So there's an element on that. Removals is going to be important, and I think Korea should start looking and positioning itself in this area. And it's got two components. The two components are nature-based solution, but also technology. And for the moment, I think in Article 6.4, to use CCS in Article 6.4 possible, and to use CCS in a 10-year or a 7-year fight, and there's nothing wrong with it. But in the end, was a next or CCS in Article 6 is something that because as we reach the end of the decade, when really the use of Article 6 becomes critical, I think that more and more removals, including technology removals, and there will be places where you can do the removals that are not necessarily on the territory of the Republic. It could be in Saudi, in Indonesia, places. So having those kind of approaches to think about and ensure that you kind of activity, I think is not important. One thing that I would really argue be important is the fact that your negotiators are going to be very active. Why? We have taken, we've negotiated the Paris Agreement. We have then negotiated the rule book, and it has, your negotiators are there, have been very active and very prominent. But what has come out is still a lot of, and sometimes the small print. In my argument is that if you want, you can use the Republic of Korea. The government thinks that this is an efficient way of helping meet an NDC regarding environmental commitments in the face of the world, while ensuring that the Korean industry maintains its global competitiveness. Then I think you want that is friendly. There are still many mechanisms will become very, and that includes Article 6.2. If, for instance, I'll give you as a final statement, you allow the review Article 6.2 to take on so many responsibilities, so many functions that they become not the jure facto, a supervisory board, unspoken, without a real mandate by the supervisory board, creating two Articles 6.4 and the other one, and start looking at the 6.4. So my plea with you is to have your negotiation be very vigilant, and remember that in the end, this is a way of markets are there for efficiency, there to maintain, to help reach the goals in an efficient way. I think that is the primary goal that we need. So I will stop here. I hope it's somewhat interesting, but your presentation has been very broad and very comprehensive. So thank you very much for your patience and for listening to me.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you for actually joining this seminar all the time in Brussels. And then I took a note the points that you made. Somehow the sound was not entirely clear, but I think that we got some of the major points. I think personally, I have several ideas and responses that I'd like to make if you would be in person in Seoul about the issues that you raised, but we'll have it probably next month in Bonn when I'm going to the negotiation session together so that we can have further discussions. Thank you again, Andrei, for your time. 자, 그러면은 두 번째로 저희 여러분들 좀 사운드
Speaker. The sound was not clear, but I think that you catch some major points. In summary, I like to say that there could be many opportunities, but something which is very complex and which is not clear enough. And I thought that it is better to think about how to utilize the Article 6 and conditions of the Article 6, and the nation itself need to design their own mechanisms. I think that was the major point, and I'm on the same page with him. And I think that the Republic of Korea can utilize and combine the CDM and the ICMO so that we can create a new international cooperation mechanism. And I hope that the Korea can present a new mechanism for the global society. And you also mentioned about the club, international club, and a small number of countries who are sharing the same ideas are moving together. And in case of Germany, they are discussing a lot about the carbon, and Korea is also actively engaged in the discussion on CBAM. And it is not the same thing, the carbon thing, which is led by Germany, and the CBAM. And we need to think about ways how to collaborate well with other countries. And you also pointed out the international organizations, and we also need to understand how to utilize the international organizations in our endeavor. Next, I'd like to invite the second speaker, Dr. Suzi Kerr. Dr. Suzi Kerr have studied and has expertise in this issue, and he is very active in the international community. And we have participants from the Ministry of Forest Service, and the Glasgow meeting emphasized the importance of forest sector. So we will talk about how to do the LEAF coalition and how to mobilize the billions of dollars of investment. And this fund, EDF, is leading this effort around the world, and she is not available in this time due to the time difference between Korea and the US. So we invited Dr. Suzi Kerr as in the pre-recorded video. She has very meaningful insight in his video. So we will meet Dr. Suzi Kerr in pre-recorded video.
It's a great pleasure to join you today. I'm really sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. What I'd like to talk today is to share some thoughts about how Korea can best invest in developing country mitigation efforts, utilising Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I want to address the two questions that I think you're focusing on today. First, what needs to be done by Korea to use ICMOs to meet its NDC target? And specifically, what are the related rules of Article 6? And then at a sort of deeper level, how can we combine the use of Article 6 mechanisms with climate development finance in developing countries? And I want to particularly focus on two issues: how we can do that using what we call jurisdictional mechanisms, where a jurisdiction is a group of firms or a group of different parcels of land all brought together, as opposed to a project which tends to be focused on one firm or one land user. The group of firms needs to have some sort of legal agreement. So it could be a sector, some sort of legal structure. It could be a sector, it could be a state, it could be an entire country. And also looking at large-scale government-to-government agreements and how those can create highly credible reductions and support private flows of finance and capability. As we all know, we need more ambition and action. We need to use mechanisms such as Article 6 to enable us to be more ambitious, to make stronger pledges, and we need private finance in order to implement those. And most of the mitigation that we're trying to support has to happen in developing countries. So what you're seeing in this picture is the emission reductions that are required in 2030 if we are to be on a 1.5 degree pathway. This is based on modelling by the European Commission, and it shows that 76% of those emissions happen in developing countries. And they're not going to be able to support those entirely on their own, either in a financial sense or in terms of technology and capability. So we're going to have to work together to achieve this. Climate stability requires, just the simple science of it, that countries jointly reach net zero emissions, and faster is better. But the rate at which we can expect individual countries to mitigate and the ultimate level that they make this contribution is going to vary a lot. So countries that are wealthier, such as Korea, New Zealand, where I'm from, the European Union and the United States, might be expected to fairly rapidly reduce emissions down to net zero, and then beyond net zero actually contribute negative emissions, possibly through mechanisms such as Article 6. Other countries using just their own resources, some of these emerging economies might be much slower. So countries like Chile and China, their emissions are still growing. It might take a little while to peak, but then they could be expected to fall fairly rapidly too. Other ones, like somewhere like Indonesia or maybe some African countries, might be much slower still. And I've just drawn these are not meaning anything in particular. But if we really want to get onto a 1.5 degree pathway, we need to speed up the reductions, not only of Korea and New Zealand and the United States, but also of countries like Indonesia, who have a lot of emissions reduction potential, but they're unlikely to be able to achieve it rapidly. So why do we use markets? Markets are a means to transfer the resources from the countries like Korea to the countries like Indonesia. So we trade, that's what a market is. We trade those who have the resources to offer for mitigation but don't have the emissions reductions opportunities in their own country, transferring those resources to the other countries who can offer the opportunities to reduce. They can offer willingness to actually implement those opportunities, but they need the resources to do that. They need the finance, they need some of the technology support, etc. Markets can enable action. They can enable those who want to act but don't have the resources. They can enable them to do so. They can enable a company who would like to act but without changing our economic structures would lose profit and might become unprofitable if they take aggressive climate action. So if we have markets for carbon, that can enable those actors to do what they want to do but are constrained from doing. It can also incentivize and push action by those who are not particularly interested in acting. It makes it profitable for them to act, and it makes it unprofitable and increasingly costly if they don't act. Also, markets critically engage the brains and the knowledge of a wide set of actors. We need everybody we can to be shifting their behaviour in thousands of different ways if we're going to efficiently and effectively achieve our climate goals. We need everybody's knowledge to be being guided towards the goals that we're all seeking. And markets can really help with that. Markets can also mobilise the capital, the investment capital that's needed, and move the capital away from the damaging directions. But markets are not something that have to happen on their own or that can be effective on their own. They have to complement and in some cases will finance non-market efforts. So it's not a choice between markets on the one hand and regulation or direct aid and funding of projects on the other hand. Both of these things can work together, and we're going to need every tool in the toolbox. So we know that governments and multilateral banks, while they are an important part of solving climate change, they simply don't have enough resources on their own to solve the whole problems. So they need to be strategic about how they use their money. What are the things that they can do that private markets are not going to do? So they can focus on building the capability and the capacity within the countries to implement changes. They can support innovation. to both in policies, but also in technologies that need to be adapted to specific local circumstances. And they can remove the country climate risk from investments, enabling the private sector to make the large investments that we need. From modelling, we know that if we can get these efficient resource transfers from the developed countries to the developing countries and do that in a really effective way, we could double mitigation with no extra cost. We can't do that with projects, but we can do that potentially with some of these other mechanisms. And that would involve huge transfers of carbon credits and of resources. So this modelling suggests that you would need 2 to 4 billion tonnes of emissions credits traded annually through to 2035 to achieve the doubling of ambition. And that's associated with, if the carbon price is around $50 US, which is actually quite a low price, if you look at the prices that are predicted to be required to achieve our goals, that's about 100 to 200 billion dollars of funds being transferred. And that's not investment capital, that's not loans, that's payments for the actual economic costs involved in implementing these more aggressive mitigation actions. And to put this in context, under the Clean Development Mechanism, only 4 billion units have been created cumulatively since 2001. So all the effort that has gone into Clean Development Mechanism projects has only produced 1 year's worth of credits, and most people consider that a lot of those credits were actually low integrity and didn't really reflect true reductions. And now we're ready. Post-Glasgow, we have the Article 6 rules. Article 6.2 is ready to go now. We can start doing trades under Article 6.2. It provides for the use of ITMOs towards nationally determined contributions, and also for mechanisms such as CORSIA, which is the aviation agreement. They can also be used for the voluntary market, the voluntary carbon market. So these ITMOs can be used in a variety of places, and that is now provided for under the rules. The parties themselves develop guidance for the robust accounting and transparency. The specific piece that has been defined clearly now is the avoidance of double counting, and that's done through corresponding adjustments, and those rules are now clear. So what I'm trying to show here is a little bit about the basics of how emissions-based accounting works. So you've got two countries. On the left, we've got a buyer country, so that's a country like Korea, and Korea has an NDC, so that is reasonably ambitious. So even after lots of effort within Korea to mitigate and reduce emissions, it's likely that Korea's inventory emissions will still be above its NDC target. And that's not a failure on Korea's behalf. It means that it's having an aggressive NDC target. Obviously, over time, it does need to bring those emissions down, but it might be that it's much more efficient to do those slightly slower. In contrast, you have a country that may be Indonesia, where if they really aggressively mitigate, they may be able to get their net emissions well below their NDC target. And the reason for that is that they have a lot of mitigation opportunities, and because they are not a wealthy country, their NDC target is relatively less stringent, and that's fair, that poorer countries are expected to bear less of the load of mitigation. So you end up with a situation where Korea is above its NDC target and Indonesia is below, and that creates the opportunity for trade. Indonesia, the seller country, can create some ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, and those get added onto their emissions balance until it's close to their NDC target. There may be a gap left deliberately. And then those ITMOs can be transferred across to Korea, and that reduces the emissions balance on the Korean side. And the amount that is added in the seller country is equal to the amount that is subtracted in the buyer country, and there is no double counting of the reductions. So Article 6 avoids double counting. If a country authorizes a transfer, so the seller country authorizes the transfer out, it is an ITMO, and there must be a corresponding adjustment. If you're going to use ITMOs for international compliance, for nationally determined contributions or CORSIA, then you have to have a corresponding adjustment to prove that there is no double counting. But if a country doesn't authorize, there doesn't have to be a corresponding adjustment. So for example, in the voluntary market, a country may choose not to authorize transfer of units out of a project that might be used in another country. That is acceptable. And so there is potentially double counting between the compliance market and the voluntary market. And the way to interpret that is that the voluntary market is helping the countries to achieve their compliance targets. What is critical is transparency. It needs to be clear whether credits that are issued in the registry are associated with corresponding adjustments so that we are sure which countries are in compliance and which are not, and what the role of the voluntary market actions actually is in each case. Article 6.2 can support emissions reductions and increased removals in any sector, including the land sector, and it doesn't limit the methodology types used. So new methodologies can be created under Article 6.2. It will take some time before countries are ready to implement authorization and corresponding adjustments. There's just some capacity that needs to be built for the accounting, but that doesn't mean that mitigation can't start right now. Authorization and corresponding adjustments can apply retrospectively. And all of us who've worked in climate change know that it takes quite a while from the time when you create an agreement to the time when there are really large reductions occurring. So that's an even greater reason to start now so that we are creating those emission reductions, and the scale of those reductions is growing over the next few years. It's not that many years until 2030 when we really need large credit flows to be happening. So what does this mean for Korea? Korea needs to be clear, to make it really clear that any trading it's doing internationally, any transfers or buying of ITMOs or credits, is not that Korea is buying its way out of its commitments. Because that is a huge fear internationally, that all the work is going to have to be done by the developing countries. So Korea needs to show that it is working really hard within Korea, that it's mitigating ambitiously, and that it has a credible long-term plan for decarbonisation. It also needs to build relationships to support accelerated mitigation in developing countries. There is not going to be a liquid global market with high integrity credits anytime in the near future, if ever. And so the credits will be generated through smaller trades among smaller groups. That's better for integrity. It also means that the countries are not only transferring money, but they are also transferring capability, they're sharing ideas, they're developing, co-developing technology. There are company-to-company relationships going on. Korea will need to choose which countries it can most helpfully engage with, probably countries where Korea is trusted and where it can be effective, maybe because the sorts of mitigation that is required is something that Korea has experience with, or where there are cultural or company linkages that it can draw on. And as it develops these trusting relationships, it can support the local capacity building. It's one of the key roles for government funding in this space. And third, it needs to develop, negotiate, and implement strong, high integrity cooperative agreements that can actually generate the flow of ITMOs. The huge barrier now is not just whether we are demanding credits internationally and willing to pay for them, but are the countries that could sell actually able to do the reductions and provide those reductions over and above what they are trying to achieve for their own targets and in a way that they can continue to achieve their own targets. So to make these dramatic changes in the developing countries, agreements have to be large scale. They have to involve a large amount of funding. They need to involve a lot of tons of reductions so that we can be confident that they really are additional and they really are making a systemic difference. And ideally, these relationships are not for just a few years. It's not a dip in, buy a few credits and then race off and do something else. It's a genuine longer term commitment to working together as we all move towards the decarbonised economy. We argue strongly that most of these credits need to be jurisdictional. They need to be done in such a way that we can be confident that there is systemic change and that we're not paying for reductions that would have happened anyway, and we're not paying to reduce emissions here simply to allow emissions to increase somewhere else through leakage. And there is no one fit all cooperative agreement that is gonna work. It's gonna have to be adapted to local conditions. When we get some of these working very well, and we already have some working in the REDD space, then we'll learn and we'll be able to share that knowledge, but it will still need to be tailored. So we're very happy to be working with the Centre for Climate and Sustainable Development Law and Policy on one aspect of this, particularly with a focus on natural climate solutions, but also more broadly. And how do we really get these agreements across countries to be effective? Natural climate solutions are important. They could contribute up to 29% of the net reductions needed for a 2-degree pathway. We're writing a handbook, a series of briefings, and aimed at producing a handbook to lead people through the sorts of decisions that we have to take in order to make natural climate solutions crediting really effective. And that's an ongoing project, and we welcome involvement in that. In particular, we're focusing on avoiding tropical deforestation because deforestation is almost irreversible. It can grow back gradually through reforestation, but it takes a very, very long time to reach the sort of carbon stocks that were there before. And sometimes the losses are not, sometimes the forest actually doesn't grow back. And on the positive side, Brazil has shown that it is possible to make dramatic changes in rates of deforestation. So this graph shows in grey the levels of annual carbon dioxide lost as a result of deforestation, rising rapidly through till 2004, when the Brazilian government introduced a wide suite of policies to really reduce the deforestation for their local reasons as well as for global climate. And as you can see, after 2004, as they implemented these policies, deforestation fell dramatically. And that wasn't at the cost of food production. Cattle continued to increase through intensification, and so did soybean production. And even more impressively, in the Bolsonaro years recently, although deforestation has started to rise again, and we've seen that all over the news, it's nowhere near the levels that it was back in 2004. So a lot of these efforts have proven durable, even under political challenges. So how can we combine the use of Article 6 mechanisms with climate development finance? So the key messages I'd like to bring out are, first, that private capital and engagement is critical. We can't do this just through governments. But also, jurisdictional agreements are going to be key for most areas of reduction, if not all, and if we're going to have effectiveness and integrity. And a jurisdiction requires some level of public sector involvement because a jurisdiction has to be a legal entity. It has to be a large legal entity. Those generally are government of some description. And we can make agreements, cooperative agreements among small groups of countries. So it doesn't have to be a global UN defined agreement to support high integrity markets. And those markets enable the participation of private actors. So driving deforestation to zero requires the public and private sectors. Current funding, public funding for REDD seems huge. It's on the order of $1 billion a year. That's a fraction of what is needed to meet current NDCs. Our estimate is about $8 billion a year. And the potential is much greater still, could be as much as $40 billion a year to put the world on a 2-degree trajectory. $40 billion a year is not going to come from taxpayers. The Green Gigaton Challenge is trying to mobilize public and private funding to reach some of these targets and put those into really solid efforts to reduce tropical deforestation and protect tropical forests. So the second thing that we argue is that we really need to use jurisdictional crediting. So in forestry, just as an example, currently or until very recently, most forest protection was done in relatively small projects dealing with one community and its area or a small or even single landowner. And jurisdictional is not about taking lots of small projects and aggregating them. It's about defining a large area, creating your baseline and doing your MRV on that entire jurisdiction. We can do that because of remote sensing. We could also potentially do this sort of jurisdiction-based crediting for methane leaks from oil and gas production, which is also a major contributor to global warming and something that is quite possibly very cheap to reduce when we know where it's happening and why. We can observe methane remotely. At the moment, that's done from satellites to a certain extent, but the higher precision stuff is all done by airplanes. But EDF is about to launch a satellite which will provide high precision data that will allow quantification of emissions at a regional scale. So why work at this jurisdictional scale? The first reason is that systemic change has to happen throughout a system, and you're more likely to get the major parts of a system if you go to a larger geographical scale. We need not only actions at a company by company level, but we need to change infrastructure, we need to change regulations, we need to change education systems. Those actions happen in the public sector, and then they flow through to the private sector. It also avoids leakage within the jurisdiction. You avoid the problem that one firm reduces, but that just increases the pressure to emit in some other firm within the same place. It avoids it because all of it is captured within the accounting because you're accounting for all emissions within the whole jurisdiction. It also is beneficial because it means that information is more transparent. You're using public data sources or satellite data that can be third-party verified to create this transparent data set that is used to create the baselines for how much emissions would have been without the effort, the jurisdictional agreement, and also to do the MRV of what actually does happen over time. That transparent information gives people confidence, gives us confidence that we're making real change, and so that mobilizes external support, and it can lead to a massive improvement in additionality because you don't have the imbalance where there's a lot of private information held by firms and those who are trying to verify credits are trying to guess what the firms would have done otherwise. Also, although there is a real cost of setting up a jurisdictional agreement up front, once it is created, if you make it effective on a large scale, the transactions cost per tonne are going to go down really dramatically, and we need an enormous number of tonnes. So thinking about what is required for success, we need huge agreements, we need large numbers of tonnes, and in those cases, the transactions cost will be low. Whereas if we have to do it project by project by project by project, the transactions cost will be overwhelming. So who actually can get together and do these agreements? Small self-selected teams are going to be a much easier way to create agreements, easier to negotiate, easier to manage, and easier to build trust within small groups. So this is just an example. Maybe the host country So this is just an example. Suppose that Indonesia is the host country and it chooses to work with, say, Korea and the European Union, because Indonesia has a lot of mitigation possibility and probably Korea on its own won't be able to fund all of it. So I'll need to work with some other partners as well. The way that the agreement could be created, which is a model that we're calling a CAT, or a Climate Action Team, is that you start by agreeing on a modeled projection of what would happen in a business as usual case. So what would emissions look like over time at a national level in terms of CO2 equivalent? But emissions aren't going to be that high because Indonesia, like most other countries, has already committed to doing some reductions on their own. And using the fact that they've already agreed to do some reductions, use that to negotiate a baseline across all the years against which you can create credits. And that's at a large scale. And because of the reductions that are already below business as usual, it's credibly additional relative to business as usual. And then to do the monitoring, reporting and verification, what you're actually monitoring is using the inventory rules. Because those are standardized rules, they're not perfect, but they're consistent across time and they're transparent. And the difference between those two defines the amount of credits that are potentially available to transfer. And all of this is well-defined and transparent. And it can be used as the basis to enable private sector involvement. So an agreement that involves Indonesia and Korean governments, a government-to-government agreement, can enable credits that can be used then for the Korean ETS. So it could be that the Korean government enables the companies to have the rights to buy some of those credits that are ultimately coming from Indonesia. And conceivably, Indonesia could do the same thing on the other side. It could implement the agreement in part through some sort of emissions pricing system or accrediting system, and it could even enable those companies to directly transfer those units to Korea if the Korean government also agrees to that sort of approach. So final thoughts, the private and public sectors need to work together at a jurisdictional scale to meaningfully implement Article 6.2. It's now possible, and many of the building blocks are already in place. And it's not just about cash. Capacity on the ground is key also. We could have all the legal instruments set up, all the incentives set up, and still not have supply. So governments and private companies need to engage with those who are working locally in developing countries to strengthen capacity and facilitate rapid implementation of effective action. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your meeting.
네, 여러분들 저기.
So what about the second presentation? She has a different tone from the first speaker. The first speaker is a negotiator, and the second speaker is the climate economist. So with the same issue, they provide us different insight. And during the presentation, she mentioned something that you might know well from the government. What is traditional approach? If it is project-based, it is very small, so it means that we should proceed at the provincial level. That's what she meant by jurisdictional level. CDM can reduce 4 billion tons, but if we utilize it well, we can reduce it by 4 billion every year. Under the CDM, we could reduce 4 billion for many years, but it could be saved and reduced within annually under the new mechanism, and it will be very effective. That's what she mentioned. And she explained ETS, and many systems are in place in Korea. And how it is related to the inventory. And Dr. Suzi Kerr may not know well about our target, so there might be some confusion for you, but you can have some insight from what she mentioned. And climate financing contexts need to be considered, and other financial means should be coordinated in terms of policy. And EDF, as far as I know, is working together with major countries to conduct the business and to develop the business with the developing countries, and it provides the consulting. So the two speakers provided the different aspects. The first speaker provided the aspect from the perspective negotiator, and the second speaker provided a speaker from the economist perspective. And I hope that you can get many things from these two presentations. So we managed the time well, so we are on track now. So we will have a short break until 5 o'clock. And then we will invite the panelists to proceed the roundtable discussion. So now we will have a short break until 5 o'clock.
네.
Now we will start the roundtable session. As a first segment, I'd like to talk about the points to be discussed in the roundtable discussion. And we listen to the presentations from two experts, and we listen to the global trends and the issues from different perspectives. In summary, I'd like to say that there will be a lot of opportunities, but we need to prepare a lot to seize that opportunities. And in this roundtable session, I have invited many guests. I invited 7 panelists, and who are public officials or who are working for the professional organizations related to the climate change. The reason why I have invited them is that there have been a lot of discussions on this issue at the government level, and the participants here today have met in several occasions to discuss and share their ideas together. And I think that is a great opportunity for them to be here together to make a mechanism or system that can consider the Korean national circumstances so that we can present the national mechanism that can be utilized and applied in the global market. And I think the panelists can work together and join their heads together to create a Korean-style mechanism. I'd like to ask each panelist to present their statement. I'd like to give them 7 minutes, respectively, and if time is in short, I'd like to let them know to stop their statement. NDC implementation is the domestic issue, and Article 6 is the international issue. So the international and domestic issues are mingled together. Sometimes it is domestic and sometimes it is international aspect. And from the international perspective, I think that the parties means countries. It means that cooperation and negotiations are required among countries. And at the domestic level, there are many ministries. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are important for each country. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs are not doing all the things, but their role is very important in the international negotiations. The first panelist has another schedule, so he could not afford to make speak and attend this roundtable session. So instead of him, I invited Mr. Chung from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nice to meet you all. And I'm Mr. Chung from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'd like to mention that the speaker.
But I will try to at least answer to the questions raised in English. 그래서 일단은 제가 먼저 7분 내에 발언을 드리고요. 혹시 나중에 질의응답이 있을 경우에는 편한 언어로.
So you can raise question either in Korean or English, because I'm bilingual. The Article 6 was adopted. Full operationalization takes time. And I think it takes time for the full operational, because reporting and system is required to be prepared, and the registry system needs to be prepared. And if there is mitigation project, there should be a process for review and authorization. All those procedures and standards need to be established to implement the Article 6. What is the most important thing is the transparency in the carbon market. And as one of the speakers pointed out, the transparency and credibility is important. So to make the carbon market take root immediately, we need to prepare, and we need to reduce the transitional period. We talked about 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8, and which are summarized and classified into 3 mechanisms which were agreed at the international level. In fact, founder and executive of ERCST participated in the meeting which was held in Geneva, and 40 professionals and experts were gathered together, and I was also joining the meeting. So I'd like to share some points what was discussed in the meeting. In the Article 6.3, ITMO for NDC purpose should be authorized by the parties. It should be authorized by the parties. It's mentioned and specified in the Article 6.3. As Professor Jung pointed out, parties can make their own decision. Parties can delegate their authority to others, to the public authorities, or credit itself or project, and the period and the process of implementing the project are subject to authorization, and it should be defined clearly beforehand. And parties and countries have a lot of flexibility because they can make their own decision. But from the perspective of review, the reason and the most important thing for Article 6 is to avoid the double counting. But when we do the review, as explained by other speaker on the PPT slide, we need to check whether it was done properly and appropriately. We need to check whether it is done properly or not. And what we need to check under 6.2 is to unique identifier. It can be applied to the project or by the tone. If unique identifier is in the alphabetic order, and sometimes can select and opt for just the numbers and the combination of alphabet and the numbers. And if different country has different mechanisms and the system, it is very hard and challenging from the perspective of review. So as one expert in the Geneva meeting said that we should consider the review perspective. And Director Andrei said that 6.2 and 6.4 is likely to be merged in the future. That's the current situation. And what I want to say is that
the current issues, the Article 6 is the annual informations with the changes and the check on the ITMO. But as you're well aware, the greenhouse gas emissions inventory would have some the gap deliveries X-3 or X-2. So by 2020, as well as by 2021, we also need to go through some statistical procedures. But by 2030, that's the first period for implementations on NDC. Then by 2030, and once we also have the NDC targets, and we also need to review the progress. Of course, we cannot only check in the year, the 2030, but through appeal by the Kyoto Protocol. But among the parties and countries, there are some the parts that the countries can check later as in terms of the post measures, so that they can also have some the given for the period. But actually, this is not stipulated in the Article 6. So for the Article 15, for the compliance issues, will be also linkage, the factors that we can review. So there are a lot of the parts to really list all the terms, but we do not really have enough time. But market is also want to accelerating the implementations because we don't really have such a flexible market conditions as the Kyoto Protocol. But for negotiators, they are thinking that as they are facing a lot of the pending issues and the challenges, they'll like to also make some prioritize their agendas and issues so that they can really have the very quick responses as soon as possible. And for your reference, in a nutshell, as the developing countries for the KP and the CDM are not the host countries, but they also have the reduction targets at the same time as they are facing some of the limitations or issues. So they are not only just sellers, but the IPC, the report, the fourth edition, but the carbon neutrality by 2050, or the carbon neutrality, the compliance, or the NDC could be also set up. And that in that regard, there are a lot of the efforts which can be also stemming from the different countries later. So there may be also some concerns. And in fact, not only just for the negotiations, but also for the implementations, along with the agreements, there also need to have some the capabilities in the managing those any potential risk factors. So there may be some the different status of their developing countries throughout the progress. And for the last comments, on behalf of the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs of Korea, and probably as we also signed the agreements for the authorization, there may be some of the parts that are to be required, especially under the Article 6.2, requiring about the 15 trillion won. So this is also ongoing for the negotiations along with the draft version. And with Vietnam, we have also signed as with the Vietnam, and that has been also effectuated as of November last year. So the bilateral agreements will be also effective as well. And to other countries, upon the request from the parties, in terms of the reviewing on the diplomatic conditions, these are our plans on behalf of the ministry. As a part of the last comments, even though we signed the agreements with other countries, such a very detailed information and technical requirements are to be also fully reviewed. But there are also some parts that we are not fully aware, or we may some miss of the important parts. This absolutely requires a lot of the coordinations or arrangements with other related authorities as we plan. So if we have some opportunities, we can also arrange for further collaboration, so that the SB, the 56, and there will be also the meeting in person in Germany in June as a kind of the part of the activities after the adoptions on the Glasgow, so that we can also looking forward to the accelerating the time, and after that visit to the Germany, and we are also planning to visit the Egypt. So that's also last the comments from my side. Thank you. Okay. So you spent about 9 minutes. So Chung Jae-hyuk, Deputy Director from the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, would really absolutely one of the experts that I'd like to also raise a very critical questions if I have some more time. But as a part of your comments, like the 6.4 or 6.2 would be also conventional. But I am also one of the personnels of the talking on the articles. But jurisdiction is actually about the project. So we don't really talk about the jurisdiction a lot of the times. Of course, for the jurisdiction, even though the experts, depending on the countries, we are so kind of the experts in that regard, for especially the CDM as well. So considering the global standard, and for my position, the climate development finance, CDF, or private sector investment for the pioneering into overseas market, for the large companies, especially the plant in the U.S., the Korean companies has invested about the trillions of the ones into the building the factory or the plants in the U.S. So that the MDC is very, very critical for the progress. So, for example, if we also have the official visit of the U.S. President Joe Biden to Korea in next month, and then the private sector is not only just the standalone activities, but we also need to come up with the measures and ways how to really collaborate between the public and private sectors. So we cannot really see such a very genuine collaborations together, private and public sectors, in accordance with the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. But if you look at the Article 6, still it may be also some part that we can also see some opportunities. But so considering your comments, absolutely the future could be also one of the rosy pictures if we also have the good hopes and the good signals. So taking this opportunity, as you're also putting a lot of good efforts on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea, so we're also looking forward to seeing your more efforts for the climate change. And next, to the general audiences, putting the very responsible roles, and we also have the Carbon Neutrality Commission under the presidential office. So I'd like to also give the 7 minutes to you, Mr. Choi, Ms. Choi. I am the Director of Communications and Cooperation Team of Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth Commission, Sang-Hyup. Probably you are not really familiar with our team and our commission. So let me briefly introduce about our commission. As of last year, our commission was launched under the presidential office as of the last year in giving some visions and objectives with the core foundations. Our commission has been also renamed with the Green Growth Commission as well, in addition to the carbon neutrality. And as we also have the Carbon Neutrality Act, which has been effectuated of this year, so the decrees for the carbon neutrality and the green growth, the roadmap is being suggested, especially for the ITMO, the 35 trillion won in terms of the budget is also allocated for the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement by the technical support and the project of finance. So these are the requirements and conditions from the government. And if you look at the clause 6, and there are some of the parts in which there are some collaborating the parts between domestic and the foreign companies for the project. As you're well aware, our government for the upgrading the NDC implementation has been also reduced about the revised upward by the 33.5 million ton. In this regard, regardless of the types of the institutions, and still the environmental integrity is very crucial. and at the same time such very effective and such very sophisticated and the streamlined processes are absolutely to be required for the such handling the interest of the conflicts. So that's also one of the major goals that we are trying to put on.
So we are trying to find a compromising point, and we are talking about how to implement the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we have listened to a lot of good opinions, and 6.4 provides a framework from the bigger perspective, and flexible and customizable approaches are provided under 6.2. So we are working on the notice of the Carbon Neutrality Act, and we are designing the processes for the 6.2. Regarding the 6.2, there are two models presented and proposed. One is a joint credit mechanism from Japan, and Switzerland and Peru made a bilateral agreement in 2020, and we are reviewing the two cases. The JCM mechanism of Japan is very similar to our intention, because we are trying to do the international cooperation. And after the nuclear accident in 2011, Japan promoted the zero nuclear policy, and there was argument that they would not meet the NDC target without the nuclear. So Japan made an effort to transfer their knowledge to the developing countries. And Japan has been conducting 199 projects in 17 countries. The three government organizations are working together in Japan, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan are leading the efforts for bilateral agreement, and other organization is in charge of reviewing the project, and the Ministry of Environment is responsible for the environmental related matters. So there will be a credit of 2.1 million tons, but we need to achieve the 330.5 million tons. So we think that it might be hard for us to reduce and meet the target of 33.5 million tons with the Japanese model. And we are skeptical about the Japanese model only. So as Professor Jong pointed out, we need to present the Korean style model. And as Dr. Suzi pointed out, the judicial approach will be helpful. And Switzerland is also leading the efforts, and the Switzerland model is very different from Japanese model. Switzerland is working on the purchasing itself. It will purchase itself. It is very practical one. And Switzerland are working with the African countries, including Ghana and Georgia, and they are negotiating with other countries like Mexico, Chile, and other countries. So they are focusing more on the purchase of ITMO rather than focusing on the capacity building of developing countries. So for Korea, what way we need to take? How to design our governance for the Korean future? We have thought it about a lot, and we need to have a ministerial level collaborations and cooperation so that we can implement the system as soon as possible. Dr. Suzi Kerr and the director Andrei of ERCST provided us with good insights, and I look forward to good and close cooperation in the future. Thank you very much. The Carbon Neutrality Commission's role is to create the synergy of the work that is done by many ministries in Korea. The Commission has focused on the implementation at the domestic level. That's my thought, and it is very important. But I like to say that the Commission need to think about the international aspect, and the Carbon Neutrality Commission has a domestic experts. So you need to think about the role and the collaboration with other government ministries, and that's your task to do for effective implementation. And personally, I'd like to add one more thing. I showed you a slide, and I mentioned and emphasized that this is very helpful if you understand this slide. And there is a mechanism that can be designed at the national level. The mechanisms can be many, like 10,000s or hundreds of thousands. So it is like a little twist of the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol, and JCM needs to be adjusted, I think, according to the Paris regime. And I thought, and I raised a question regarding the ITMO, the purchase of the ITMO. It will be very argumentative because many government or people raise the question why the taxpayers' money go to purchase the ITMO. It could be the form of ODA, but it could be combined with a ODA or cooperation with developing countries. From the Korean perspective, if we collaborate with the developing countries, it will create a job in the developing countries. But it will be a good opportunity as well for the Korean people. And it will create a lot of opportunities for the private sector as well. As I have seen many discussions, I have seen such model, so I think that's why we need to create and design a Korean-style model. And the big difference from Kyoto Protocol is that each country will have a strong ownership, because Kyoto Protocol did not pay much attention to that, but under the Paris regime, they need to report every 2 years. And under the constitution of Ecuador, it says that it prohibited the transfer of the ITMO. And Dr. Suzi Kerr said that there would be many opportunities, but we should be cautious, because if the private sector invested in the developing countries, if the country itself domestically prohibit the transfer, it could be a risk. It means that negotiation is very important. It is like a FTA level negotiation. The government should not redesign it. The bigger picture should be seen, and the collaboration and sharing ideas together among government ministries are very important. That's my personal thought. It is my proposal. That's my personal thought. Thank you very much. And next, there are many organizations, and in Korea there are 2 ministries which are working hard, which is the Ministry of Environment and which is the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Energy. So I'd like to first ask Mr. Kim Do-hyun from the Ministry of Trade, Industry, Energy for sharing his thoughts and what activities are conducted at the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. This ministry is designing many projects, and I will give him 7 minutes.
Nice to meet you all. I am Kim Sang-Hyup, Deputy Director of the Overseas Emission Reduction Team of the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. Actually, the name of our team is very long, as enacted by the Carbon Neutrality Act of Korea under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And still, how to utilize the Article 6 has been also attracting a lot of the more interest within Korea, as they presented as of the last year for overview report. Among the 164 countries, the 120 countries, along with the Paris Agreement, have committed their willingness to commit their targets, and 74% was the proportions. So for the NDC target, with a very ambitious target, and in order to realize those ambitious targets, absolutely, we also have to have the competitions with other countries for collaborating together. In this regard, how to make those related programs will be our first stage. On behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the person from the Foreign Affairs has talked about the overview on the international, the circumstances. But on behalf of the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy, let me also share with you how and what project have been conducted for the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, along with the future action plans. As previously mentioned by other panelists, as of the March the 5th, with adoptions and effectuations of the Carbon Neutrality Act within Korea, and the official notification, especially on the Carbon Neutrality Act, is still ongoing. On behalf of our ministry, administrative, the procedures, or any parts not really having a lot of the burdens or overlapping the parts are the key focus of our ministry, to really focus on such a joint project. And our ministry is also trying to adopt the comments and opinions of the businesses. So businesses and experts were also joined together to form the Council for the growth and the carbon neutrality as of the last month. And from the Kyoto Protocol and towards the transitions into the Paris Agreement, especially the Article 6 implementations, there are a lot of the issues and the comments that the parts and our efforts have been a little hampered, so that businesses required to have the more sites by the 6.2, the Article 6.2, to really have their more rooms for their capabilities, as also highlighted by the businesses. And with the implementations for the Paris Agreement, still there are some of the parts that they have to also negotiate with other international companies in advance when actually in fulfilling the NDC targets for themselves. There may be some uncertainties, so that they also requested the ministries to really act the concrete actions in advance, so that they can have some more better opportunities in the launching into the new and overseas markets. Considering their opinions and comments, of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be also the leading institutions. We are also helping in realizing those issues as well with the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, as we do also support a lot of the parts. And from next year, our ministry will be also conducting the overseas emission reduction project. And we are still trying to allocate a new budget for the emissions reduction, the project, which will be also require about the 15 billion won. In that regard, the KOTRA or the Energy Corporation, as well as the buyers and the sellers involved in the carbon neutrality will be also joined together as we also try our best efforts to do so. And that was the end of our overviews on our actual performances. And let me also share you more further the future directions. As mentioned previously, for businesses, when it comes to implement the overseas emissions reduction, for those with the high potential capabilities in realizing the overseas emissions, and probably for the second half of this year, and such a very open door mechanisms or the framework will be also available. And for the second part of under the CDM and CCUS, or like the hydrogen, the future food, are to be also fully more reviewed in the future. In that regard, the proactive efforts and the approaches are to be more reviewed by Korea. Considering these circumstances, we'll be also planning to have some more programs. And last part is about the finance-related issues. As of last month, as announced by our ministry, the ODA, in line with the overseas emissions reduction and the ITMO, like for FX support, or any collaborations with international organizations by utilizing the ODA support, we can also discover the potential overseas emissions reduction project. Of course, that only cannot fulfill all the feasibility in terms of the economic spectrum. Therefore, such ODA will be also reformed as one of our future plan. As also touched upon by the Professor Suh-Yong, for the overseas emissions reduction, the project is in the very early stage. In that regard, such a very passive, the efforts or procedures, of course, that can also be very important by reflecting other countries' best practices like the Switzerland. But still, we also need to make more our efforts, not only just to have very cost-effective overseas emission reduction project, but at the same time, we can also induce the more carbon-related project at the same time, leading to the more quality jobs and the more job opportunities within the Korean market. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy is one of the key authorities by transforming our natural status up to the G7, the member countries. So in the future, in that regard, there may be a lot of the more roles and responsibilities that are to be also mainly led by your ministry, like CCES or hydrogen or CCUS, as you mentioned before. And probably the modeling are to be also fulfilling as well at the same time. Other countries' NDC are to be also reviewed for the NDC targets and their potential capabilities. Still, I'm sure that all the participants here, and how to really is that our option to really increase or decrease the ITMO? Still, we may also try some making the changes on the ITMO as well. But such guidelines are to be also more complemented as one of the trading countries. And in terms of the international market, still, we also need to put our more efforts proactively in the international market so that we can also really upgrade our national status. Of course, the project-based efforts is also very important, but still for the very individual, the companies, they're very capable of doing that. So that in terms of the nuclear, the power, there may be some of the parts that we can control by utilizing technologies. But under the new administration, they are not only focusing on the nuclear energy, but they're also working on the energy mix by utilizing the renewable energy sources to reduce about 8% in terms of the reduction targets into the transitions of the clean energy resources. So considering these circumstances, the nuclear energy market in the international market, like led by the Middle East, of course, I have also stayed in the time in the Saudi Arabia. They're having the potential markets and seizing more opportunities as a mega size, the project and the CDM involve their businesses or related stakeholders. And then we can also consider their situation, so that by borrowing their best practices, we can also put our best wisdoms truly finalize the mega scale, the project, and those related outcomes as well. There have been a lot of issues, especially mainly on the ETS related project, and there have been a lot of the systems in implementing such the ETS. But in addition, there may be the more and the larger the project are to be more concerning in the future. Of course, as there is a touch upon by the director and executive director, the Andrei Marcu before, because the starting point actually under the article, the 13 of the Paris Agreement for the inventory management can be also the one of the key factor, but the transparency under the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement are to be also collaborating together so that we can also improve our rules together to really improve our contributions as well. And then the policies are to be also more further investigated, especially on the energy sector, as the energy sector is very critical. So your also roles and responsibilities will be also welcoming.
Next, energy sector is the main organization in the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, and in the international community. The rising area is nature-based solution, which is the solution based on nature. And one of the outstanding area is the forestry. According to the report, many countries set the goal to reduce the carbon emissions by 2030 at a low cost. And forest is the sector that can reduce the carbon emissions at a lower cost. So more than 100 leaders from countries participating in Glasgow emphasized the importance of forestry sector. And as Dr. Suzi presented in her presentation, forest can reduce the greenhouse gases a lot, and it induces many private investment. The key is how to sort out the things under the Paris Agreement and how to link it with the NDC. Recently, the World Forest Congress was held in Korea, and President Moon participated in the forum. And the framework we can use is the forest sector, which can be the safest way, and RED Plus project can be one of the ways we can consider. And I'd like to invite the Park Young-hwan, who are working for the Korea Forest Service, for his thoughts regarding the forest sector. Nice to meet you. I'm Park Young-hwan from Korea Forest Service, and I'd like to very pleased to be here in a very meaningful meeting. And I'm the only person who are from the administration level organization, and other participants are from the ministry level organization. And the forest can play an important role in the process of reducing the carbon emissions, and that's why I'm invited here today. The thing I want to explain is the RED project and the future directions. And I'd like to also ask you, the participants from government ministries, a favor. Regarding the carbon emission credit, forest sector is not to reduce the carbon emissions that was already emitted. The forest sector can play the role to reduce the carbon emissions that is already emitted. Forest captures the carbon by nature, and it is the most reasonable and the safest way to reduce the carbon emissions. And as mentioned in CCUS is an artificial way to store and capture the carbon, but forests can be a nature way to reduce the carbon emissions. In that regard, Professor Chung pointed out that the RED project is a kind of natural-based solution. It has been implemented since 2015, and we are running 3 projects in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos, and it is a pilot project. And last year, we get the recognition of the 65 million tons of the CO2 in Cambodia last year, and we are making investment. And we are trying to expand such projects across the world. The reason why we are doing this is that based on our experience, we thought that there is a balloon effect. The reason we protect the area, keep the forest, but the nearby area is experiencing the deforestation. That's why we are trying to come up with the ways to avoid or prevent the nearby area deforestation. If this project takes root, we will expand this project at the national level. This year, we are working together with KOICA UMP to conduct a project in Congo. And if it is stabilized, we are expecting the reduction of 5 million tons of CO2. We have listened a lot about the NDC, and we need to observe and sink 20 million of carbon every year. And additional amount of zinc will face limitations. So, RED project, which can be related to the overseas reduction, can be helpful. It is not just about the NDC, a RED project in perspective of NDC. Basically, a forest is the habitat for all living organisms. So we are thinking about the protecting our habitat and the living organisms living in that habitat. So these areas were recognized as a protected area, and a RED project can contribute to the global efforts to protect the environment. In the future, we will promote and induce the private sector's involvement in the RED project. As other speakers pointed out, national resources are based on the taxpayers' money. So national resources cannot be used only for the RED project. So companies who are responsible for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions can participate in the RED project to protect the forest. Last year, the Ministry of the Trade and Industry and Energy included the ESG in the guideline. ESG is another form of the corporate activities. In the past, the companies were conducting the CSR activities, and these days it has been developed into the ESG, environment, society, and governance. And this ESG management has been the issue among many companies. So to conduct the ESG management, 4 groups, SK, POSCO, are participating and trying to participate in our RED project, and they are conducting the feasibility study at this moment. So what we are now doing is that we are promoting the national agreement and national negotiations and involvement of the private sector. And for the RED project, a lot of large area of forest land is required for the RED project. So we will let the corporations know what will be the burden for being participating in the RED project. And we are also conducting the project, and we are preparing for the project in Vietnam. And we started the negotiation for the project in Vietnam. And last week, there was a Global Forest Week congress last year, and another meeting is held in other countries, and my boss participated in the meeting which is being held at this moment. So if discussions are done well, I think this kind of project can be expanded further. I hope that the RED project can contribute a lot to the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions of 500,000 tons. And this administration will be expanded further. And I'd like to ask you a favor, that your cooperation is required. Companies are participating voluntarily based on the ESG management perspective. But if it is linked, it can be linked into the ETS, many companies will be interested in this project. Companies are interested in this project, and as REEF was introduced, REEF was the platform that was developed for the participation of the companies, and it was launched in the last year's COP meeting. And there was a fund of $1 billion, and global companies like Amazon participated, and some Korean companies wanted to participate in the framework, so we had a meeting with those companies. And we already made the agreement with those companies, and we will make them prepare for the next year's meeting. So I want the Korea to make a READ program that can be led by Korea. And I hope that we can create a Korean leading program.
For the implementing and the making up with the RED project, we'll be also accelerating our efforts. But for the ESG governance, there will be also the investment from the private sector. But by utilizing the good finance for the NDC implementation, and probably for the governments and the interest and the benefits for the country as well as the businesses, we are also trying our best efforts to have the collaborations and make some accelerated outcomes. Thank you very much. Thank you. Recently, for the IPCC report, if you look at the result of the IPCC report, especially the things out of the under the forestry the sector will be also very critical. So as you also presented by the EDF, the presenter previously, so 1 gigaton, the high quality 1 gigaton is one of the key factor for the purchase agreement. Of course, we can buy the credits, but for the taxpayers, we also need to consider their perspectives. So by considering those conditions, we also need to follow very better pathways. So cost effective by 2030, the GHG reduction targets, as well as the jurisdictional approaches coming with the very attractive, the outcomes will be also very better understandable for the future. And as you also pointed, a lot of the comments from the KFS, Korea Forest Service, let me also spend a few seconds The REEF was also mentioned by the previous institutions, and for REEF, the credits that in which the companies are taking are not or corresponding the adjustment. For businesses' perspectives, when they actually bring the credits, those credits can be also go through the VCM, the voluntary carbon market, like the ETS or the compliance mechanisms in the market will be also a very effective tool. But for the perspective of the government, in terms of reducing the ITMO and corresponding adjustment will be also a very key factor that we can utilize under the policies. In that regard, there are some very tailored circumstances in Korea or ETS, the market and tools should be also categorized as the compliance market as well. Of course, the Ministry of the Economy and Finance has not really fulfilled those the key capabilities yet, but probably there are some of the rooms that we can also listen to the more comments from the Ministry of the Economy and Finance later if we have some more time. In addition, there are a lot of the mentioned on the international organizations, but if we visit Ethiopia under the Article 6 and ODA project was also one of the key example, and our team, including by myself, was also worked on the $12 million for the ODA project in the past, and as we also discussed before, under the Article 6, the capacity building programs under the mechanisms. Of course, the international organizations are very also capable of doing so. But for the perspectives of the international organizations, still, we also need to have very clear and smooth communications with them on the purchase agreement. So please also make some more your efforts on the monitoring and reviewing some of the guidelines. And as a host country, by utilizing those rooms, we are not only giving the ODA finance, but at the same time, we also need to consider how the Korean tailored the mechanisms could be fulfilling other countries as a part of the ODA project, so that such government monitoring capabilities are to be fulfilled in advance, and now we can really have the international cooperations after that. There are a lot of the very new ways on the mainstreams, the models within Korea. So the GCF or the G7 or GGGI will be also focusing on the foreign affairs perspective. So please also utilize and optimize your best efforts. For example, for GGGI, as one of the only secretariat office of the international organization located in Korea, so that we can also utilize such a partnership with the GGGI if we can have some possibilities. So sorry about that. I have mentioned a lot of the sentences, but probably, absolutely, in terms of the waste, the greenhouse gas emissions is not only limited to the definition of the waste, and probably there are some the parts that you can wrap up as one of the overall responses. So that's why we have invited Director of the Ministry of Environment, Ms. Ha. Good afternoon. I am Director of Climate Change International Cooperation Team of Ministry of Environment, Ho Hae-in. On the Paris Agreement, Article 6, and the NDC implementation, we are talking on the title of the forum, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. And with the international cooperation, as well as the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs for the decrees and the ordinances, especially we are started to have the notification, the work after the drafting divergence. And still, the four sectors are classified into making the registry under the Article 6. When it comes to the related task, any issues or any related information will be also shared in a few minutes. First of all, when it comes to proceeding our task, the major concern was to how much we can really reduce our NDC or make some the efforts for the ITMO. And these are still ongoing concerns. And for Korea, with the adopting the corresponding adjustment as a part of the carbon emissions roadmap, and once we propose and suggest our Korean tailored the roadmap, as also the doctor mentioned about the annual basis or annual amount of the estimated values, but still the figures will be also more specified once we also finalize the roadmap. But for the timing of the international emission reduction, the project, and probably 2025, we can expect to see some of the emission reduction targets as a result. So these can also require to do more discussion later. And depending on the mechanisms, in order to secure our mechanisms, the Ministry of Environment is also working on making the roadmap for greenhouse gas emission reduction. So let me share with you the overview. With Vietnam and Mongolia, we have signed the MOU on the greenhouse gas emission reduction. And probably the Ulaanbaatar, the capital city of the Mongolia, was one of the pilot project city. The Ministry of Mongolia has also visited Korea to sign the MOU. While we are proceeding on the greenhouse gas emissions reduction as well as the methane reductions, and still this is very important to reduce the methane as well. And second part, the ODA interconnectivity is very important. Let me also share more ideas on that. In a very large framework, and still our ministry is also talking and considering the two key factors. First, cost-effective mechanisms. Second, the environmental integrity to be fulfilled. For the cost-effective mechanisms, as also to talk about the climate finance or CDF, and probably I also made some of the time throughout the presentations, but still there have been a lot of there are to be more active discussions participated by the national organizations as well, and the direct investment or GHG reduction in kind or other types of the purchase are to be mixed together so that we can really have the optimized Korean tailored investment tool throughout the processes. Till actually in advance the payment could be also absolutely are to be the maximized and fulfilled. But by considering the public, the sentiment or international concerns, we also have to consider a lot of the different variables.
The second one is the cost effectiveness of the cost effectiveness. According to the corresponding assessment, we should consider the economic feasibility. So we need to consider whether it is really and actually economically feasible or not. And the alternative to this mechanism is that currently it is practical to promote the green ODA. ODA focusing on climate change, such as the hydropower project or landfill ODA combined with the methane recovery facilities. The kind of combined project can be helpful. We need to develop the model in this direction. And it can be used as a complementary measures. And what is important is the negotiation. As Professor Chung mentioned, it could be a FTA level meeting and negotiation. We were not on the negotiation table, and the first negotiation will be held in the second half of this year. And we need to think how to win trust from other parties and how to create a win-win result. We need to gather our wisdom to create a win-win situation. We can share policies, or we can provide the policy advice. And it will be a good opportunity for us to achieve the better results. When we discuss it with the Vietnamese government are in the process of legalizing this one, and Indonesia did not provide immediate response. And Indonesia and other developing countries are going through the internal process. So we need to gather our wisdom together. The third one, the economic feasibility, is about the profitability and the reduction outcome. We need to identify the projects that can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and increase the profitability, and we can work together with the Ministry of the Industry so that we can share our wisdoms together. And we need to secure the economic feasibility, and the government need to decide that the MRB level, it can be. So there has been many discussions regarding the avoidance, but how strict the MRBE can be need to be considered, and we need to nurture the capability of the verification agencies and the verification ability of the professionals. We need to make the other parties understand the corresponding adjustment and other knowledge level, and in that case we can be on the same page regarding the environmental integrity. So we are considering how to increase the environmental integrity, and there has been a lot of questions regarding the ETS, so I'd like to add one more thing. ETS is like a compliance mechanism. It covers the 70% of the rains in Korea, and it is the strongest measure in reduction of the carbon emissions. Under the current ETS system, there is a 5% flexibility mechanism, and this system recognizes the offset outcome. If a company are conducting the business in other countries, it is recognized as a reduction outcome with the upper limitation of the 5%. And if it is over 5%, it could be an obstacle and disruption in meeting the NDC target of Korea. So there could be a discussion or opposition regarding the private sector's burden, and we need to discuss more about this. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to hear the last point you made. Some government ministries do not know much about the ETS system, and you introduced the current status of the ETS system. I think ETS is a good system, but ETS should be separated, and ETS should be considered in connection with the overseas reduction. ETS is not the condition for the overseas reduction. The key is that it is better to utilize the ETS for overseas reduction. Many people think that the ETS is the project for the developing countries because of the legacy of the CDM. It may take some time to link it with the ETS of other countries. It is better to utilize the ETS, but it is not a must to link it to the overseas reduction. Dr. Jong-Won is the specialist in the ODA, and sometimes I participate in the review in the ODA, and when I visit the developing countries are willing to participate in the ODA process, but they are not prepared. In terms of transparency, developing countries, even though they have a willingness to do, they do not have an inventory in many sectors. So if we enter into those countries for the overseas reduction, that kind of inventories or infrastructure should be established first. When we go to the site in developing countries, we can find answers. Environmental integrity is important, and as you pointed out, greenhouse gas reduction information center's role is very important. It is the only top-down approach in the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And if we establish the framework, we can apply the framework with necessary modifications in all developing countries. AD3 is the standard developed by the EDF for their project. So we need to apply this approach so that we can establish the framework to review whether the RED project can be executable or not in the developing countries. So we need to think about how to make a Korean-style model that can work in the international community. We can make and design those kind of models and propose the Korean-style mechanism so that international organizations can apply our Korean-style input and mechanism. So it is desirable for Korea to propose the input first. We have a good intention and purpose so that we can develop our own approach and apply it to the global community. Then I'd like to ask Dr. Jong for a 7-minute statement.
Good afternoon. I am Jong-Ji-won from Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. We are also participating in such a seminar that we learn a lot of the things. So today's forum was a very meaningful event that we have learned a lot of the things. And as you also touch upon a lot of the things, and I was also able to learn a lot of the things, especially in fact for the government policies and negotiators for the NDC implementation. They're also joined by a lot of the institutions, but I am also on behalf of the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. So ODA and development cooperation are the key research factors for our institute. We are also supporting the policies for the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, and the Ministry of Environment, and the Ministry of Economy and Finance as well. And probably my comments will be kind of the wrap-up or summary of all the previous panelist comments. And regarding especially on the ODA, and as a specialist in ODA project, as you also mentioned a lot of the times on the word, the ODA, but still, within the ODA community, the climate change issue is not really deeply reviewed under the ODA project. Of course, we have some parts that we can focus on the improving such a climate change under the ODA project, but still, in the nutshell, we have not really have the very full spectrum in the realizing the climate change under the ODA project. In this regard, let me also give a wrap-up or a summary on our research backgrounds. Throughout our research, let me also share with you some updates as well. As we also participated in today's program, especially the roles and responsibilities of the government is definitely mandatory and critical. The direct ITMOs, acquisition by the government, as the first part, or the second part, to induce or give some more support on the businesses for their participation, which can also require some of the more finances for businesses to have more participation in that regard. We also have to consider those measures. But for the second part, in which the businesses can participate, let me also share some of the roles of the government in inducing more private sector engagement. Of course, investment is also a key factor. When it comes to making investment into the international market, as a very key commercial and trading country, and Korea is one of the open economies. Now we're also facing very significant timing of the making overseas investment. But as always, the governments, the roles and responsibilities in leading to the private sector engagement is absolutely mandatory. But when it comes to the businesses involvement and the launching into the new international market, still we have to consider those related issues. And as you know well, the proportions or the ODA, the number of ODA projects is still in a very steady increase. But still, it's not really true that we are also inducing more investment from other countries at the same time. Still, we need the more support and help from other countries for our domestic companies to have some more chances. But still, we have not fulfilled such very high level of the outcomes for the ODA project so far. In my opinion, for making our domestic companies to have more participation, still we have to relieve any uncertainties and mitigate risk factors. And the third, we have to provide more ways for businesses to have the international market access. And for the definition and spectrum of the uncertainty, we are going to come up with the more efforts by negotiating with the stakeholders as well. So to all the participants and representatives, probably your willingness and your efforts will be also welcoming. And risk factors mitigation is very important. Of course, by having the private sector investment still, the project is the basis, but still the support is to be done from the government. In terms of the development cooperation, as a type of the PSER, as a type of the private sector engagement, and we also call that the term the mixed finance for the negotiating organization perspective. In that regard, the businesses can have the more rooms for investment along with the development finance at the same time. And for Korea, on development finance, absolutely, we are so fully aware of the necessity of the development finance, of course. But this is not only limited to the climate change finance, but also for sustainable development, so that these can also be broadly involved as well. Absolutely, this can also require the more conditions for the policies and guidelines. We absolutely need to have some more consensus and common understanding among the stakeholders between the public and private sectors. Still, development finance is very important and needed. If we have some development finance, still we have very only few numbers of the cases that we have completed so far. For the ITMO and related issues, I also believe that we would have some of the more further rooms for the mitigation efforts and making some more outcomes in the future. As also touched upon by the Professor Chung before, we are only working on the developing country, but once they have like development tools, and we can also have collaborate together with the developed countries like the US as well. For the development finance, we can have some more collaborations in there afterwards if we have some more capabilities with the US. When it comes to the overseas, the coordination together, let me also share with you about the joint mechanisms as well. For the ODA, the project with the more enabling factors for ODA project, as you also highlighted before, yes, it's true that the ODA project is not only just the sole factor for mitigating the greenhouse gas emission reduction project. This absolutely requires the technical assistance like the policy advices or capacity building programs, as well as the feasibility study. When it comes to the feasibility study, I'd like to highlight that one because for the national level, the feasibility study is very important, especially for each of the NDC. each country would have their own NDCs, and one of the very first, the information, like Indonesia, while they are having their national guidelines or regulations on the NDCs, once we also have the signed with other countries, so we have to also review the feasibility on the potential partners when it comes to the making or the signing the MOUs for the MDC or ITMO later. When it comes to the policy advices or the capacity building programs, and still we also have to enable our domestic companies to really have more further room for them to really having some more new opportunities. But what important here is that for the international market access, still we have to be fully aware of the recipients, the recipients' countries. Of course, even though we want some parts, still on the perspective of the developing countries as recipients of the ODA, some parts they are not really recommended or strongly requested from their side. Therefore, we also have to have more common understanding on the capacity building programs together between the Korea as well as the developing countries as recipients of the ODA, so that we can offer the mechanisms in realizing those outcomes. Afterwards, so in this regard, of course, I have also listened to other comments, and based on the information and still very tangible outcomes of the ODA project are with one of the pushing and the growth engine for the further international policies. Thank you very much. That's all from my comments.
Thank you very much. My team is involved in the ODA project, and when I am involved in the ODA, ultimately nurturing the experts is the first step to do the ODA. We need the technical professionals with technical expertise. That is very important thing. And I know that you are doing the ODA, and at the starting point you are doing the things in what way, but we need to nurture the experts with technical expertise who knows the local conditions well and who can deal with the cross-cutting issues. It is not a short-term project to nurture the experts. If we don't have such an expert, it's a missing point. It's a missing for the universities. So we need to consider how to nurture such an expert. As Dr. Jong pointed out, blended finance is important, and blended finance is important, and Davos Forum will be held this year. And what was the most important issue in last year's meeting was the blended financing. And if there is a private sector risk, the private sector will not participate. The public sector can serve as a priming to induce the involvement and participation of the private sector. So there is such a proposal, but there is no specific process for the blended financing. And blended finance is a key point, and I think there should be an organization or institution that can support such a blended financing. In the international community, there is a private sector facility which plays the role of helping the developing countries by mixing the private sector and public sector together. So ODA cannot solve all problems, but ODA can play an important role if it can open the door for the cooperation with developing countries. And each ministry are conducting the ODA projects, but we need to consider whether it is good to proceed the ODA at the ministry level or integrated government level. ODA And climate change, it has a short history, so we need to pay attention to nurture the professionals with expertise. And I'd like to invite the last panelist, who is Ms. Chung from the Korea Legislation Research Institute. I'm Jong-Un from Korea Legislation Research Institute, and we held the 4 international forum last year, and we had no idea how to proceed with the global forum last year. But with the help of Professor Chung, these forums were held with fruitful outcomes. Regarding the topic today, Mr. Chung, the Professor Chung, is an expert in this area, and we requested the forum with this subject. Our research institute's YouTube was not that popular, but during the 4th forum last year, when Professor Jong explained the Article 6, there was a lot of views among the researchers. And the viewers proposed some requests, like the more detailed workshop on the Article 6. There was a lot of such requests from last year. That's why I proposed the topic for the first Global Forum for 2022. That's why we have the topic Article 6 of the Paris Agreement for this forum today. And I hope that we can get a lot of help from Professor Jong continuously in the future. Our organization is focusing more on domestic laws, and we are considering how to link the Korean domestic laws with international laws and rules. We analyze the regulations regarding the climate change. And regarding the international construction project, we had little knowledge, so we could not provide a significant contribution to that. Law and Enforcement Act and Paris Agreement were not determined fully, and after the determination, we were in the stage of finalizing our Laws and Enforcement Act. What is my concern is that, as pointed out during the discussion today, there should be a national authorization for using the ITMO for NDC, and it is related to the regulation. And our organization analyzed the regulation, and originally we thought that this regulation requires a quantitative analysis, but there was no point for the quantitative analysis because some parts of the Article 6.2 were not confirmed at this point, so we cannot confirm anything in the enforcement decree. So we only did the quantitative analysis. So we should incorporate it into our notice. But if it is included in the notice, there will be a lot of problems and issues in Korea. So we need to take a differentiated approach for this issue. Usually, we do not touch the Act and enforcement degree of the Act, but we need to incorporate all those international discussions in the revision of the Act and Enforcement Act. And that kind of revision needs to be discussed in the future, I think. If we don't understand the international discussions, including the Article 6, we cannot make a proper law and enforcement decree. And if we don't understand well about the international discussions, we cannot apply those international rules fully and effectively in the domestic situation. So our institute is considering how to make and how to design our domestic laws, incorporating all those international rules and regulations. And we are open to your proposals and advices so that we can contribute more on this issue. Thank you very much. Scope of the panelists is different, and I think Ms. Chung has the largest and widest scope that can deal with many issues. Her role is not just compare and analyze the international and domestic laws. I majored in law, and when I participate in many meetings and conferences, I wonder if there is any expert or many experts involved in our discussion who can provide the technical advice. Dr. Jong pointed out that we need to consider the ways to establish an advanced legal system. So finally, all should be incorporated into the legal system and law. And those kind of legal perspective should be involved from the initial stage so that finally we can come up with and establish a well-defined and established laws and regulations. Thank you for your statement. And we are behind our schedule by about 30 minutes. But it was very meaningful to hear from the panelists from many departments. The Korean government has enough capacity to lead the discussion and present a role model for the global community. I hope that this serves as a good opportunity for Korea to lead. And this concludes the Global Forum on Climate Change Law and Institutions. And thank you for your participation. Thank you very much.